So I'm getting ready to cut the pattern out of the fabric, but let's look at the pattern pieces first. This front pouch is a little bit different than the other pouches I have on my other patterns. It's fuller width-wise and it's deeper lengthwise. And you'll notice here on the front, from the waist to the first notch, it says cut on fold. So there's not going to be a seam here. And the way we're going to lay this out is we're first going to lay the back pattern piece on the fold first, and then we'll estimate how much we need underneath it. That's just to conserve fabric instead of having another length down here for the fold of this pattern piece. Additionally, you can cut out both pieces in lining, and typically I like to line both of the pattern pieces. However, in this instance, I'm only going to line the front pouch, which can be pretty common in men's swimwear of this type. But I generally like to line both pattern pieces, and that's to protect the fabric and also your skin. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pull back on my folded part of the fabric. And I'm going to get a good width here. And since I'm using a plaid, I can actually see where my straight fold is here on the edge here. And let's see how wide that is. So the width here is good, but what I'm going to be looking at here is, can I get my front pouch on the fold here? And all I need to do is find one of these lines to line it up here and then flip it over to see if I have enough fabric here left over. And I think I can conserve a little bit more. So I'm going to pull back till about here. Realign that up here. Make sure I've got one of these lines in my plaid. Now if you don't have a plaid, you'll just have to eye it, make sure everything looks pretty straight and that there aren't any weird pulls here on the fold. So I'll line up my back pattern piece here again on the fold. That looks good. Then if I find a spot here on a line, fold it over, I know that I'll be able to fold the fabric over here and cut this piece out of the self fabric without a problem. And also my width of fabric here is 1/2 yard. So it looks like you could do with a little bit less, but they won't, if you're at the fabric store, they're not gonna cut you anything less than a 1/4 yard anyway. So they like to cut 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, and a yard. So I'm gonna go ahead and get ready to cut my back piece out. Now if you have a good straight line up here, you could push your pattern piece all the way up to this edge, but notice that I have a notch here, and whether or not you want to clip out this notch or not is up to you. This notch here on any of the sizes is your 1/4 width mark, so that's for applying the elastic. I'm going to move this down a little bit because I don't trust this edge up here. That way I know I'm going to get this straight line. And while I cut this out, I'm probably going to speed up this video. Okay, so now I am going to cut the front pouch, and I laid it up on this line here. So what I'm going to do on this is I'm going to take that line, I'm going to fold my fabric right on that line. And just so I don't have to turn the pattern over, I'm going to flip this so you can see it, see what I'm doing. Flip this over. Now it's still going in the right grain direction, and I can line this up here on the fold, conserving that fabric. Now understand here at your notch, this is where we're actually going to start cutting all the way around. All right, and if you want to see the whole pattern piece, I'll unfold this really quickly. And this is what it looks like. And when we sew it, we'll fold it over this way, and we'll sew around here and gradually coming back up, just like we would finish a dart. But let's cut out the lining. Okay, so let's take care of this front pouch. So here I have the face side. I'm actually just going to flip this so face side to face side is together, and I'm just going to go ahead and pin around the area that I need to sew. And I think that I cut this on the face side, so I'm actually going to flip this one as well. Double check your lining to make sure that you cut it on the correct side. So what we're going to do, I'm most likely going to start here, so I'll have to reposition my pins. So from here all the way up and then gradually sew off here. When you sew off, don't cut the extra threads. What we'll do is we'll use the sewing machine and we'll actually sew those down to the seam allowance so they won't unravel. That way your seam will actually stay intact. Okay, so very quickly what we're going to do is this extra thread that we left, what we're going to do is we're going to fold it back onto the seam itself, and we're just going to stitch it down right here in the middle, and then we can clip off the extra. And what that's going to do is it's going to keep this, help it from unraveling while it's being worn. And we'll do that to both the self fabric and the lining. All right, so now we need to do the crotch seams, and we're going to enclose this one. So the first step we're going to do is show the face side of our back piece, and then we'll take the front pouch, turn it face side out, so you see the crotch seam there, match it to the crotch seam there, and we're just going to pin this to keep it together real quick. All right, so then we're going to turn this over so we see the wrong side of the back. And we're going to take the lining piece, turn that face side out, so we see the face side edge there, and we're going to match that to the back crotch seam. And then we can repin so everything stays really secure. And we'll just sew across that seam. All right, so now we will turn the lining over to the face side here, and I'm going to match it to the self piece, and I'm just going to pin it here at the top. And just to show you, to lay this out kind of sideways, here's the front pouch and then the back. Now, one thing you can do if you want to make sure that the lining doesn't move all over the place is that you can come in here, turn things out, inside out, and kind of run the seam up on top of each other and just tack it there. Okay, I'm gonna do that. I am gonna do that. Okay, so I'm just gonna pin it real quick, and I'm just gonna tack it, and I'm gonna tack it like on the base of the pouch, but I'm only gonna do it right here in the middle of the seam allowance, maybe for just a ½ inch. That way, if I can show you this, then your lining won't move around on you. Okay, so I tacked that off camera. I figured you could handle that without seeing that on the video. So basically it's just kind of tacked to the seam allowance at the bottom, and now I can turn that back over the self. Okay, so here we have the two pieces, and what I'm going to do is turn it to the face side. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to now match these side angle seams up to the side seam here. Now, I know that I enclosed the crotch seam. You could enclose this seam as well if you want to go ahead and do that. I'm not going to show how to do that because then you have to, it's kind of like a bit of a maze to get it to turn back right to the right side. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to do a regular seam, and then I'm going to do a top stitch, a small zigzag top stitch over the seam to hold the seam down. It gives it kind of a little bit of a sporty look. Now I'm going to take this side and match it up to the other side. All right, so we have the two side seams pinned. They're not really the side seams, they're just the angled pouch seams up here, and we're gonna sew across here. Okay, so just really quick, I'm going to do a zigzag here on the top, And what you just want to make sure is you want to make sure that your seam allowance is pressed toward the self, the body of the garment, and not toward the pouch. I suppose you could do that, give it a different look. Try either way, see what you like better. I like it when it's pressed toward the body of the garment. Also notice I didn't clip the extra overlock threads, and that's so I have something to pull at, help it through the machine, because sometimes these machines don't like to actually pull at the very edge. So I kind of leave these long so that I can help pull the fabric through the machine. Okay, so now we can trim these extra threads off. And then we need to talk about the leg elastic that's going to go around here. So I know in my previous patterns and videos what I've done is I have sewn a ring, divided it into fourths, and then divided the leg into fourths and then matched the pins. That takes a lot of time. I feel like it's quicker to actually just apply the elastic like they do in the industry, and that's just basically starting at one point and sewing it all the way around and then ending where you started. I would advise you, however, that on this pattern I actually didn't put notches on the rear part. So if you can imagine the top of this curved part and then the bottom of the curved part, this is where it covers your rear end. And in this area, when we stretch the elastic, we need to stretch it a little bit more than we normally would. This will help bring it back and actually a little bit more to actually cup your rear end, which will hold on, the suit will hold onto your body. So as you sew around the leg, you do want to stretch the elastic a little bit. And the reason you want to stretch it a little bit is to help it recover from being stretched out while you sew. As you sew, it's going to stretch out both the fabric and the elastic, and you need to stretch the elastic just a little bit to bring everything back to its original shape. When you get to your markings here on the rear end part, you're going to stretch that a little bit further, just a little bit tighter to make that a little bit more snug on your body. Now, where do we start the elastic? I'm laying this out, so generally I kind of look like I have a side seam on either side, even though I don't. You can fold up the fabric at your center, right? And then put a pin at the center back, and you'll need to do this anyway for the waist elastic. And then you can match that center pin back to where your center line mark is, and then mark here on the lower edge, on the leg opening here. Remember, you already have these notches for your side seam here. So now I've got my pins marked where the side seam is, probably on the leg opening. So where I'm going to start, I'm actually going to start right about here. It's on the back side, right? Actually, I'm going to have to flip this over because the machine is going to sew that a little bit differently. So I'm going to have this way. This is the needle side of the machine, so that's why if you're looking at it on the video, it looks a little upside down. On this side, though, I can put this one just here on the downside of that side seam pin. All right, and now I'm ready to go to the machine. Okay, so now we need to turn the elastic and we will zigzag the elastic down. If you have a cover stitch machine, you can also do this with the cover stitch, but understand that when you're in the machine on the cover stitch, you're actually going to be looking at this side and not this side. So I'll just quickly pin this in several places. A lot of times when I do this, I don't actually even pin it, I just turn it, but I want you to understand that this is how it goes, and when you turn it over, it should be flush with the edge of that elastic. So this side I will pin down and the other side I will not. And then when you zigzag, I'm setting my machine at 4mm width and 4mm length. You want to try to catch one of the stitches just on the edge here of this to cover that, to hold everything down. All right. So you'll see how I deal with it being pinned as opposed to not being pinned. Okay, so we're ready to start the waistband, but one thing I forgot to mention before we did the leg elastic is that when you turn it over, you're going to have to stretch it back into shape. So you'll have to stretch it to meet the garment, and then it's best to actually stretch just a little bit further. That will give you a little bit more give when you wear the suit. Now in this area, it looks like I stretched a little bit too far. That will just make it a little bit more snug in that area. But understand that this is still actually a good size hole for this size medium. Okay, so let's prepare the elastic. So cut the length of the elastic that you need, and then on each of the cut edges, mark a line 1/2 inch. And I'm using a erasable pen. You can use pencil, or this is going to be hidden, so as long as you don't have a light colored fabric and you're marking with a dark colored pen, you won't see it. So then what you'll need to do, you'll need to match on top of those lines, right? And you don't have to pin it, but I'm going to, because we're going to stitch straight across that edge, that mark. Okay, straight stitch across it, and just make sure that you have a single loop. Okay, so I made a mistake. I forgot to put the buttonhole in for the drawstring before I put the elastic on, so that's why you're seeing the elastic sewn on now. In the next section you're going to see me put the elastic on and there won't be a buttonhole there, so for your benefit I ripped this section out to do the buttonhole. So the way I like to do the buttonhole obviously needs to go into the center. It's not really marked on the pattern, but you can mark it again where your center was, and I'm going to put it right here where this line is. It lines up to the center seam here. If you have fabric that doesn't have that, then you'll need to fold it where the center is, mark where the center is approximately, and then you'll put your buttonhole there. Remember that this elastic that we have on here, we're putting on here, is 3/4 inch. So if you line up your ruler 3/4 inch here, your buttonhole has to go in between there. And remember, you've got about a 1/4 inch seam of your overlocking. So just on the other side, so in that middle 1/4 inch is probably the best place to put it. So now you can mark it with a pin or a pen. I'm just going to put a little mark here approximately with my erasable pen where the buttonhole is actually going to be going. And depending on your machine, I have a one-step buttonhole. I just put a button in the foot and the size of it. And you only really need about a 1/2 inch buttonhole or opening. Now I could have just, cut a slit open. Generally, this type of fabric doesn't fray, but after a while it might wear open further. So that's why I'm actually going to do an actual buttonhole. And what I like to do is I like to take a piece of muslin or a decent quality scrap of woven fabric, preferably cotton, and I'll put it on the back, of course without the elastic. I'll put it on the back where the feed dogs are, and so the feed dogs will pull the fabric through. Now sometimes the presser foot will stretch the fabric as you're sewing, so sometimes if you have a stretchy fabric or a slippery fabric, you could also put a piece of muslin on either side and then cut the extra off. And cut it close to the buttonhole. No one will ever know the difference. So I'm just going to do the one side of the muslin on the wrong side, and we'll see how it does. Okay, so now we're ready to attach the elastic to the waist. The first thing we need to do is we need to divide the elastic into 4ths. And it's best to fold it here on the stitch line all the way across. And here you can either put a pin, but what I've done, I've used an erasable pen and I've marked this. You could also use a pencil. If you use a regular marking pen, beware that if you use a dark color and you have a light fabric, it may show through. But since I marked this already, I'm not going to put a pin in it. But then what you need to do with that is match that mark to the stitching line, and then on either sides of that, you'll either put a pin or a mark. Those will be your side seams. Now for the garment, you'll need to divide the waist into 4ths as well. And the way we'll do that, we'll start at the center front at this seam and just fold up along where that is to the waist and put a pin. Then if you haven't already done that, we already marked the center back, but if you haven't marked the center back, then you just need to fold this very carefully in half and put a pin. Actually, put a pin, looks like I'm a little bit off, so I'll repin that at the center back. And remember, we had notches on the pattern for where the side seams were. If you didn't cut those out, then go ahead and match your center front and center back pins that you just made and even them out and walk up, and then go ahead and put pins on the side. I do have the notches, but I'm going to go ahead and put the pins so you can see that visually. Alright, so now we're all pin marked, and then we're actually going to pin the elastic to the waist. And I'm going to match this stitching. This, I like to put the seam at the center back, so I'm going to match that there to the center back. And I'm matching the edge of the elastic to the edge of the garment. And then I can just follow this around the garment to the next pin. And I didn't do that very well. On this side I have the mark here, but I'm going to match that to where the pin is. And then I'll continue walking. I know it's hard to see. Walking around until I get to the center front pin, and I'll find my other marking, my center front marking. Put that here. Again, I didn't realize I needed to turn the elastic over so you can see it. That's where my mark is. And then I will continue walking around to the other side seam. And again, there's my marking, and here's my side seam pin. I'm gonna mark that, match that there. And now I have it all pinned up to the waist. And now all I need to do is overlock the elastic to the garment. Okay, so I had a heck of a time getting this into the machine to do that buttonhole, but the buttonhole has been done. Lesson learned, to make sure you put the buttonhole on before you put the elastic on. So now that the elastic is all on, we've got our buttonhole, then we need to actually just turn the elastic. And when you turn the elastic, make sure you're turning it here at the edge of the elastic and rolling that over to the edge, and then pin it in place. And I'm going to do this just in a few places around the waistband. When you stitch this, you will probably want to stretch it just very slightly. That will give the fabric a little extra give when you're wearing it. So I'm going to sew this. I like to start, you can start at the center back, or if you like to start at maybe the side where it's maybe a little bit less noticeable, wherever you choose. I think I'm going to start at the center back. And I have my zigzag set up at a 5mm width and a 3.5mm length. I'm doing a bit shorter length and a shorter width than I normally do because the buttonhole is so close to the overlocked edge here. So I want to make sure that I don't get that zigzag stitch in there where I'm going to actually have to cut this buttonhole open. So now that's all turned, I'm ready to zigzag all the way around. Okay, so now all we need to do is insert the drawstring. And I'm using a paracord. It's a bit narrow. You could use a wider paracord if you want. This one doesn't stretch. You could also use a polyester drawstring. It's kind of expensive if you can find it. Normally in other fabric stores you would find a cotton drawstring that's braided. If you use the cotton, make sure you pre-shrink it because it's going to be getting in water and then you're going to be washing the suit, so you don't want the cord to shrink too much. Now I've cut this 12 inches longer than the waist measurement. For instance, this is 32. I have cut it 44 if I'm doing my math correctly, and that's so you have a length outside of the waist to tie it with. So the way I'm going to do this is I've cut the length and I'm going to tie a knot in one end, and I'm going to take a big safety pin and I'm going to pierce it straight through the middle of that knot. Then I need to open up the buttonhole, and a lot of times what I'll do is I'll use a seam ripper. Make sure you're not getting the elastic just to get this started. I'm going to get in here, cut this a little bit, and then I'm in there with my snips or my scissors and just snipping, not quite to the edge of the buttonhole. And then when you do that, make sure that if you've had that muslin or that fabric that you put for the buttonhole, make sure that you actually can see the elastic. Otherwise your pin will go nowhere. Okay, so now we're just going to insert the safety pin, and then we're going to wiggle it all the way through the waist. And I will speed this part up in the video so you don't have to watch me wiggle this all the way. So now that I've got this all the way back out, I want to make sure that the ends are going to be about the same length. So I'm actually going to tie this end, and then I'm going to actually continue to pull this a little bit and work the rest of this garment while I'm holding this all the way around. So the suit eats up kind of the other side, okay? So that looks pretty good. So now I can tie this. If you feel that this is too short, remember I added 12 inches to the width of the waist. So if you want to add, you know, another couple inches, you can cut it really as long as you want. So we'll just tie this, right? Turn it inside out. And there you have your new swimsuit with a fuller pouch.